Today I will share with you 3 of the most important reports you need for your multifamily buildings. Of course, there are more reports that your accountant can generate for you, but I'm talking about the reports you as the building owner need to keep updated constantly and monitor. They are the rent roll, the collections report, and the expense report. But before we start talking about these reports, why are these reports so important? For many reasons. The first and most important reason I can think of is that the laws here in New York City are so heavily skewed toward the tenant and against the building owners that every penny that you have coming to you counts. You as the building owner can never afford to start losing track of things like rental income, lease end dates, and what your expenses are. These reports monitor the health of your buildings. Your accountant won't be able to do their job without the information in these reports. Your mortgage broker and bank will need them if you try to refinance your buildings, and real estate brokers and prospective buyers will need them when you try to sell them. They will also come in handy when submitting data to government agencies. For example, the RPIE, which are the real property income and expense statements, or the annual rent registrations. By the way, check out my video, 3 mistakes to avoid with your HCR annual registrations. So let's dive right into the first report, which is the rent roll. Your rent roll is a snapshot in time of all your tenants. What should be in your rent rolls? Information about each tenant, their apartments, and their leases. Just imagine if you didn't have a rent roll, you'd have to look through a file like this every time you wanted to look up something about the tenant. This is the file for only one tenant. Granted, she's been living in the building for decades, but still, it's a lot of paperwork. The rent roll has information on: number 1, who's on the lease. Number 2, the start and end date of the lease. Number 3, what the lease type is. For example, if it's a free market lease, rent stabilized lease, or rent controlled lease. 4, if there are any government programs like Section 8 or SCREE. 5, the rent amount. If it's a free market apartment, then figuring out the rent is straightforward. But with rent stabilized apartments, it's anything but straightforward. You have to consider other factors like the legal rent and what kind of rent increases are allowed. In New York City, for example, rent stabilized increases are determined by the Rent Guidelines Board. Finally, 6. You also want to include information about the apartment itself in the rent roll. For example, the number of rooms each apartment has. Let's talk about the second report we need to keep updated. The collections report. The collections report is used to record all the rental income for the buildings. This should be straightforward, but it isn't. Why is that? Because what the tenant actually pays is not always the same as what's on the lease. For example, sometimes tenants are in arrears. Sometimes tenants don't pay their rents for a period and then pay it all in one shot. Some tenants may be on government programs. Then the tenant pays a share of rent and the government pays the rest. Some government programs give the landlord a credit on their property taxes instead of a payment. So as you can see, this all gets very complicated, and that's why keeping track is so important. Once you enter all the rent information, you can slice and dice your collections report. For example, you can get the total rents collected for the building. So that's the collections report. The next and last report we will cover is the expense report. The expense report is more straightforward than the other 2 reports. It includes expenses incurred running the buildings. Any New York City landlord knows that the expenses are massive. What are the components for the expense report? First up, it's obvious, but I have to mention it. You need to record the expense and the amount. Other things to include would be the name of the vendor providing the service or product, and the apartment and building the expense is for. You can then slice and dice this data. For example, if you wanted to know how much you spent for heating oil for a particular year. I'd be very interested in knowing what kind of reports you use to monitor the health of your buildings. Please leave a comment in the section below. We hope this video was informative. We are Premises Guardian, a property management company located in New York City. We specialize in managing multifamily buildings. If you are a landlord in the New York metropolitan area, come to the Landlords workshop and meet us in person. Relax with refreshments and sandwiches, while Premises Guardian property managers present a complimentary workshop on running your buildings more efficiently and profitably. This is a fun, easygoing way for you to ask some questions or learn from questions others ask. The workshop is free of charge, but the maximum number of participants is limited to 15. Registration will be on a first-come, first-served basis. To register, please sign up on our website.